Louisiana is historically home to over 50 snake species, and 7 of them are actually venomous. From the cypress swamps and river deltas to the rocky pine uplands and Cajun prairies, snakes seem to inhabit every corner of the state. I've spent most of the last decade documenting these animals, studying their behavior, and learning what most people get wrong about them. And today, we'll be taking a look at all 7 of Louisiana's venomous snakes. Now, before we begin, I'd like to point out that a lot of what's going to be in this video has taken years to document. It's built off of a lot of my own experience, as well as many experts in the field that work with these animals. But we're still learning more every single day. So if I missed something, make sure to let me know down in the comments. And also, if you learned something new, make sure to subscribe. And starting off, we have what is probably the most well-known snake in Louisiana. The cottonmouth is probably the most notorious venomous species in Louisiana. In fact, if you've spent any time around cypress swamps, hardwood bayous, or basically any low wetland area with fish and frogs, you've probably seen some of these snakes. In fact, they are incredibly common. As their name suggests, cottonmouths are famous for that bright white mouth display, where they coil up in a defensive position and open their mouth, where as you can see, it's a bright white coloration. But when they aren't cornered or confronted, these snakes mostly rely on their camouflage to avoid predators, either staying completely still or quietly slipping into the water before running into a conflict. Their venom is decently potent, although it's not as toxic as most people believe. It's often comparable to some rattlesnake species, but they aren't insanely toxic, especially compared to some of the snakes later on down this list. Cottonmouths, being pit vipers, have large, hinged fangs and hemotoxic venom that can cause serious pain, swelling, tissue damage, and a lot of other potentially dangerous complications. While it's unlikely that you'd ever die from a bite with modern medical care, it is absolutely not an animal to play around with. And if you're bitten, go straight to the hospital. Despite being the most hated snake in the state, they also fill an important role in these wetland ecosystem. Like other snakes, they'll eat fish, frogs, small mammals, anything that they can get a hold of. But unlike other snakes, they'll actually eat other snakes and a lot of carrion or dead and rotting material. I've even seen them eating dead birds and even insects that are smushed on the highway. Cottonmouths are interesting to say the least. Unlike their larger Florida cousins, we have what's called the northern cottonmouth here. Our moccasins on average are a bit smaller, darker in coloration, and they can be some of the grumpiest snakes in the state. But unless you're offering them a free fish meal, or they confuse your kayak for a nice floating log to sit on, they'll probably do their best to avoid you. They're certainly not out to bite you. These snakes are often misidentified with many other harmless species. A lot of water snakes get called cottonmouths just because they're near water, and my recommendation is if you ever see one of these guys out in nature, just leave it alone. Most bites happen when people try to kill, move, or even collect the snake. And yes, all 3 of those happen in Louisiana for some reason. And speaking of incredibly common vipers throughout the state, we have the copperhead. On average, are usually smaller than cottonmouths, and they're famous for their incredible camouflage. They're usually a copperish brown color, although they can be a lot lighter or even pinker, with these hourglass or even Hershey kiss patterns down their back. And this helps them blend into leaf litter incredibly well. They're probably one of the most camouflaged snakes that you can encounter. Much like cottonmouths, they're pretty common throughout the state, and in some parts they're actually more plentiful than cottonmouths, inhabiting a wide variety of habitats like pinelands, hardwood forests, but at times they can also be swamp dwellers. They are a really easy snake for most people to misidentify, and a lot of people will kill things like rat snakes, DeKay's brown snakes, and various water snakes and say that they killed a copperhead. Usually their patterns are more consistent, and if you look at these animals side by side, they look almost nothing alike. But that doesn't mean that copperheads are always easy to identify. As I said before, they can have a range of colorations, and even rare variants can have stripes or broken patterns. Now granted, out of the hundreds of copperheads I've seen, I've only seen this a handful of times. But overall, they still don't look like too many other snakes, except maybe for their close cousins as juveniles. All that aside, copperheads are certainly a snake that you want to be aware of if they're in your area. They're not aggressive, and most bites with this species happen when somebody steps near or on one, so wearing boots while out hiking or watching where you put your hand around logs or other debris will greatly reduce your chances of having a negative encounter with one. Copperheads I would consider to be pretty discreet. They do their best not to alert anything of their presence. And while our next snake is also pretty good at staying hidden, they will let you know exactly where they are if they get disturbed. This is Louisiana's most dangerous snake in my opinion. Found throughout a wide range of habitats in my home state, the Canebrake rattlesnake is what's known in other parts of the US as the timber rattlesnake. Nicknamed for the dense river cane habitats that they used to inhabit all along the Mississippi River Delta. These heavy-bodied snakes can live in a variety of habitats. Hardwood bottoms, pine forests, swamp edges, river corridors, cane thickets, agricultural areas, urban areas. In fact, I would say that Louisiana is probably the state that these snakes are the most successful in. Their size, venom yield, and surprisingly good camouflage makes these animals living landmines if you aren't careful. And their venom is toxic enough that they can be potentially deadly. While I've not heard of anyone dying from one of these snakes in Louisiana within my lifetime, I know multiple people that have been bitten by these snakes. And they were really bad, potentially even fatal bites if they hadn't gotten medical treatment. But in my opinion, those bites were pretty avoidable, as they were all bites taken on the hand and forearm, which, if you can imagine, means that they were playing with the snake or trying to kill it. My experiences with canebrakes is that they're a very well-mannered rattlesnake species. They're oftentimes very laid back, and they're not as defensive as some of your other rattlesnake species. But all things considered, you've got to be wary of them, and a bite is absolutely a medical emergency. My favorite looking canebrakes are what I'd call blue phase canebrakes, which are just these really light colored ones, and they are just so stunning. As of recording this video, I want to say I've worked with maybe between 130 and 140 of these snakes in my home state. They're certainly one to keep an eye out for, but if you give them space and you don't try to kill or handle them, you'll likely never be bitten by one. Which is good, because out of all of Louisiana's venomous snakes, this is certainly not the one you want to make a mistake with. And moving away from the big gnarly canebrake rattlesnakes, we actually have another rattlesnake species, and one that you've probably not heard of in Louisiana before. And if you have, you probably heard them called ground rattlers. These are the pygmy rattlesnakes. As their name suggests, these snakes are quite small, usually growing no longer than a foot in length, although the really big ones up in central Louisiana can sometimes close in on about 2 feet. Their venom is quite mild, and as you can imagine, they don't have a lot of it. In fact, I'm not sure we even have a recorded bite of one of these snakes in my home state. As with all venomous snakes on this list, you want to get medical attention as soon as possible, but you still aren't likely to die from a bite. Currently, you really only see these snakes in really nice upland habitats or pine flatwoods. But that wasn't always the case for the Louisiana pygmy. They used to inhabit loads of different habitats, and there's one in particular that they've been entirely wiped out from, the live oak hackberry forests. In fact, back in the 1980s, my dad actually encountered a couple of these snakes here, at the bases of hackberry trees in these sort of environments. Although most people didn't realize it at the time, these environments were falling apart. Over time, invasive species like hogs and tallow trees have turned these beautiful coastal chenères totally uninhabitable for many creatures. Also, I just realized I say the word chenère in a lot of my videos, and I don't think I've ever explained what it is. It's a French word that basically means a place of the oaks, but it's often used to describe sandbanks or oyster banks along coastal regions and other habitats that are very sandy and have oak trees. And they usually hold some kind of coastal or environmental significance. I've heard from folks that only the Southwest Acadians use this word, but that's certainly not true, as many Cajuns to the southeast also use it. I also think it's a shame that nobody in my home state really knows about these habitats. They're really important for a lot of bird species, and one of my favorite snakes in my home state, the Louisiana milk snake. All that aside, pygmy rattlesnakes are incredibly rare here, and you're certainly not going to encounter one nowadays outside of pine woods environments. And within the same uplands that the pygmy rattlesnake resides in, particularly in central Louisiana, there's another small, highly venomous snake, but unlike the pygmy rattlesnake, it is incredibly toxic. And that is the Texas coral snake. Unlike all the previous snakes on this list, these guys are elapids, the same family as cobras, mambas, and even taipans, and like them, they have an incredibly potent neurotoxic and myotoxic venom. Thankfully, I can almost guarantee you don't have to worry about them. The only time people are bitten by these snakes is when they pick them up and play with them. And they also don't strike in the same way that a pit viper can. If you've ever seen a ringneck snake before, they're these little tiny snakes that you can find virtually anywhere, and they're very skittish and they rarely bite. Yeah, coral snakes are kind of like giant, toxic ringneck snakes. And if you're out here getting bit by ringneck snakes, honestly, maybe you deserved it. While elusive, they're pretty plentiful in the longleaf pine savannas within their range. but they can even be found in more rural areas and in people's yards, which is pretty odd as we'll get into later. Coral snakes are a bit more environmentally sensitive most of the time. I guess the ones from Texas are just built better. There are other tricolor snakes that share these habitats, like scarlet snakes and sometimes milk snakes, but keep in mind, scarlet kings don't actually range west of the Mississippi, or at least as far as I know. So really the only other red snakes that you'll encounter along with these guys are scarlet snakes and milk snakes. But if you have to go off of color to identify whether a snake is a coral or not, then I'd recommend leaving it alone. Despite harboring one of the most toxic venoms in the state, I've never actually heard of there being a significant bite, and certainly there hasn't been a death. So it's safe to say that when these snakes are left alone, they're no hazard to people. Now, if we're going to talk about Louisiana snakes, eventually we have to talk about the ones that we lost. Of all the snakes in Louisiana, if you recall historically there's been over 50 of them. This one is now all but a ghost story. The eastern diamondback rattlesnake, the largest rattlesnake species in the world, historically lived in most of the far southeast edges of Louisiana, mostly tied to longleaf pine savannas. Their venom is extremely toxic, and as I've talked before in many other videos, these guys are contenders for some of the deadliest snakes in the US. But in Louisiana, you're never going to see one. These snakes are generally considered to be extirpated from the state, meaning they've gone locally extinct. Now, people kill snakes all the time, so you might be asking yourself, we still have most of our snakes in Louisiana, so why did the diamondbacks vanish, but not all these other ones? And probably the craziest claim I'm going to make in this video is that World War II killed these snakes. You heard that right. Eastern diamondback rattlesnakes through most of their range require longleaf pine savannas, and up until the late 19th century, the Florida parishes of Louisiana had large quantities of virgin or uncut longleaf pine savannas. At the turn of the century, Louisiana upped its lumber industry to a staggering degree. But it wasn't until the state received a defense contract during World War II that we really took it up a notch, as old-growth longleaf pines were actually a crucial component in building the structure for our Navy. I'd certainly recommend looking more into the history of this habitat and its downfall, as it's pretty interesting, and if you want to check it out, I'll have some articles linked below. But the point is, the 1940s were a turning point for Louisiana's Florida parish uplands, and by the 60s, many of these species that were once common began disappearing. The eastern diamondback rattlesnake has been functionally extinct for at least 40 years, but they're still rumored to exist in some places. In fact, as early as 2016, one was spotted by a private landowner via a game camera. They've also been seen incredibly close to the state line by many people, myself included. In fact, less than 3 miles from Louisiana, there's been a few seen recently. And I myself have spent the last 3 years trying to record a documentary of finding the last Louisiana diamondback rattlesnakes. It's safe to say that that production is still pending. There's a lot more that I could say about these animals, but for the purpose of this video, just know that the Louisiana diamondback has been all but wiped out. And it's not likely that you're going to have to be wary of one of these guys in the state. And if you ever do see one, that is a huge deal. And speaking of snakes that are a big deal, Louisiana's final venomous snake is the eastern coral snake. Louisiana is actually the only state that has historically had 2 venomous coral snake species. But like with the diamondbacks, these animals oftentimes live in pine savannas. Little is known about their historic range in the state as they are so elusive, and we don't even fully understand why they vanished. Eastern coral snakes, sometimes called harlequin's coral snakes, have been seen in the Florida parishes a handful of times, mostly dead on roads. In fact, the last official record was sometime in the early 2000s. But the 1980s is when most of them were seen. Crazy enough, identification might actually be one of the reasons why we have so few records of these guys in the state, as it was believed that many of them ended up being melanistic or black coral snakes. In this part of their range, mostly due to small populations leading to a lot of inbreeding or mutations, we got a bunch of very dark colored coral snakes. And color is the primary way that people tend to identify these animals. So if you took a coral snake and you made it mostly black, a lot of people would tell you it was just a racer snake or some kind of water snake. A while back, I was actually talking with state park officials about this, and many of them had heard similar reports from landowners of seeing strange solid black snakes that eventually they identified as coral snakes. And to this day, many biologists in the state want to get their hands on one and prove the existence of these black corals. But once again, none of these records have been fully confirmed. I've also had a lot of people here on the channel reach out to me and say that they've seen coral snakes in the Florida parishes. And while that might seem far-fetched at first, a lot of the locations that people said they were seeing them in were places where they historically lived and have been seen. So while it is unconfirmed, I actually do believe that there's a chance that the eastern coral snake, our most venomous snake, can still be found in my home state. If you're from Louisiana, it's so easy to write off these animals and say they'll always be around. But as we saw, that's not always the case. At the same time, there's a lot of unnecessary fear or anxiety revolving around these animals. And the best thing that you can do if you ever encounter one of these snakes is to give it some space and just know that they're not out to get you. They're an incredibly important part of this state's natural heritage, and there's certainly something we have to learn to live alongside. And heck, if we can learn to live along gators, feral pigs, and all of New Orleans, I'm certain we can find a way to live along snakes. And if you're still interested in venomous snakes, both in and out of the state, make sure to check out this video here, where we rank some of the deadliest snakes across the US. Thank you guys for watching this video, and we will see y'all next time.